Welcome to this edition of Statehouse Rock. I'm Kim Robinson, Executive Director of the Illinois Society of Professional Engineers. Statehouse Rock has been on hiatus primarily because not much has happened yet in the General Assembly spring session. The bulk of the activity will take place in April and May, probably to allow more time for candidates to focus on the March primary. Since this is a gubernatorial election year, as well as a General Assembly election year, it's probably safe to assume that not much will happen. There'll be a lot of activity as legislators introduce bills that will sound good in their campaign brochures, but no one is interested in taking difficult votes that might end up in their opponent's campaign brochures. Governor Rauner and legislative leaders have held out on a significant infrastructure bill for the governor's entire four-year term. It's hard to believe that they would be able to come to an agreement now. Regardless, today the governor outlined his fiscal 2019 budget. The governor called for structural reforms to pensions and employee health care that he says will eliminate the budget deficit and allow the state to meet its obligations for education, infrastructure, and human services funding. He called for $100 million in capital funds to meet deferred maintenance costs at colleges and universities. And he also calls for a capital grant to U of I for its Illinois Innovation Network and Discovery Partners Institute that he says will leverage billions in private donations. He's requesting $50 million in capital improvements in order to address issues associated with Legionnaire's outbreaks. He called for construction of a new 200-bed veterans home in Chicago. And he said that he intends to spend more than $36 million for new mental health facilities in Joliet and Elgin. His budget provides $2.2 billion in pay-as-you-go funds for the Department of Transportation's annual road program. Additionally, he called for $511 million in new capital funds for other IDOT needs in fiscal year 19. In total, the governor's proposed infrastructure budget calls for $7.8 billion in new capital, and it breaks down this way: $1.15 billion for EPA projects, $1.77 billion for Capital Development Board projects, $400 million for the Department of Natural Resources projects, $436 million for projects at other state agencies, $1.34 billion for projects at the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, and $2.71 billion for IDOT projects. Governor Rauner also renewed his call for approval of the I-55 Managed Lane project. And you may recall that that project has been stalled in the House for a couple of years now. Governor Rauner said that his administration has been actively engaged in conversations with the White House and the U.S. Department of Transportation. As the plan announced earlier this week works its way through the Congress, he said that he will work closely with Illinois' congressional delegation to maximize the return on Illinois' investment in its infrastructure. That program, announced earlier this week, calls for $1.5 trillion in infrastructure funding nationally. It's unknown at this point how the money will be allocated, how the program will be paid for, or what the states will be required to do to participate. Of concern to engineers already is a proposed requirement stated in the president's outline that any states that accept federal funds for infrastructure projects be required to allow out-of-state licensees to work on those projects. We don't yet know everything we need to know about that provision, whether it is intended to apply to professional engineers or not. But regardless, we'll be working with NSPE to ensure that PE licensure is protected. As NSPE Executive Director Mark Golden said this week, professional engineers clearly face a greater challenge than other learned professions. While most individual members of the public understand the legal and medical professions, they aren't as familiar with the engineering profession because they aren't typically the individual consumers of engineering services. It's harder for members of the public or decision makers that impact that regulation to understand the role of the engineer. That just makes our job that much harder, he said, but all the more important. We'll certainly be joining Mark and keeping an eye on how professional engineers may be impacted by the president's proposal. Thank you for watching this edition of Statehouse Rock.